A wealthy woman repeatedly calls police on her black neighbors, claiming they're too loud and disturbing the peace. But when the case finally reaches court, hidden security footage reveals a shocking truth that changes everything. What the judge said next left the entire courtroom speechless. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and comment on where you're watching from. Let's get started. The incessant tapping of Victoria Harrington's manicured fingernails against the polished mahogany desk echoed through her home office. Outside her window, the sounds of children playing basketball drifted from the neighbor's driveway, punctuated by occasional bursts of laughter and good-natured trash talk. Victoria's jaw tightened. 3 months. 3 months since the Williams family had moved into the house next door, bringing what she called urban chaos to Oakwood Estates, the most prestigious subdivision in Westlake. Victoria, a 52-year-old real estate mogul with property holdings across 3 states, had built her reputation on transforming underperforming neighborhoods into luxury developments. She prided herself on having an eye for potential and the ruthlessness to realize it. The Mediterranean-style mansion she inhabited was a testament to her success. 6 bedrooms, 7 bathrooms, a wine cellar, and a pristine view of the lake. At least it had been pristine until the Williams family arrived. She picked up her phone and began recording the sounds from next door, making sure to capture the loudest moments. This would be the 14th noise complaint she'd filed with the Homeowners Association in 12 weeks. None had yielded the results she wanted. The Williams family remained, their 3 teenagers still played basketball in their driveway, and their weekend family gatherings continued unabated. "Marcus," Victoria called out to her husband, who was reading the financial section of the newspaper in the living room. "They're at it again. Those people have absolutely no consideration for anyone else in this neighborhood." Marcus Harrington barely looked up from his paper. At 55, he had learned to choose his battles with his wife carefully. "They're just kids playing basketball, Victoria. It's Saturday afternoon." "It's not just basketball," Victoria snapped, her voice rising. "It's the music, the constant visitors, the barbecues with smoke drifting into our yard. They've turned this place into "A home?" Marcus supplied, finally setting down his newspaper. "Victoria, they've done nothing wrong. Their house is impeccably maintained. Dr. Williams is the new cardiothoracic surgeon at Memorial Hospital, for God's sake. His wife teaches at the university." Victoria waved her hand dismissively. "I don't care what they do for a living. They don't belong here." Marcus sighed, a mixture of exhaustion and disappointment crossing his features. "I'm going to my study. Please don't do anything drastic." As Marcus left, Victoria turned back to her window, watching as James Williams, a tall man with salt and pepper hair, joined his children on the driveway. His easy smile and patient coaching as he showed his youngest son how to improve his jump shot only irritated Victoria more. She'd researched the family thoroughly after they moved in. James Williams was indeed a renowned surgeon who had moved from Chicago to take a position as head of cardiothoracic surgery. His wife, Diane, was a professor of literature specializing in African American authors. Their 3 children, Michael, 17, Zoe, 15, and Tyler, 13, were all honor students. On paper, they were the perfect neighbors. In Victoria's mind, they were intruders. She picked up her phone again, but instead of recording, she dialed a number. "Richard, it's Victoria. I need your help with something." Richard Blackwood was her attorney, the man who had helped her navigate countless property disputes and business negotiations. "I want to file a lawsuit against my neighbors." On the other side of the hedge separating the 2 properties, Diane Williams was arranging a tray of lemonade glasses to bring out to her family. Through the kitchen window, she could see her husband and children laughing together, a sight that still filled her with joy despite the tension of the past few months. She wasn't naive. She knew exactly what Victoria Harrington thought of them. The Williamses had dealt with prejudice before, but usually it was more subtle. Victoria's hostility had been apparent from day one, when she'd welcomed them to the neighborhood by informing them of the HOA's strict noise regulations and scrutinizing their moving truck as if expecting to find contraband. "Mom, come play with us," Zoe called from the driveway. "Coming, sweetie," Diane called back, pushing thoughts of their difficult neighbor from her mind. She refused to let Victoria Harrington cast a shadow over their new home. As she stepped outside with the lemonade, she noticed Victoria standing at her window, phone in hand. Again. Diane maintained her smile, though her grip on the tray tightened slightly. "Don't look now," she murmured to James as she handed him a glass, "but we're being recorded for posterity." James didn't turn toward the Harrington house. He'd learned it was better not to engage. "Let her record. We're not doing anything wrong." "I know that. You know that. But she's determined to find something, anything, to use against us." "She won't," James said confidently, though Diane noticed the slight tension in his shoulders that hadn't been there moments before. 3 weeks later, the Williams family was served with legal papers. Victoria Harrington was suing them for consistent and deliberate noise violations creating a hostile living environment and negatively impacting property values. She was seeking an injunction to prohibit them from using their driveway for recreational purposes and demanding $75,000 in damages for emotional distress and property devaluation. "This is ridiculous," James said, reading through the lawsuit in their kitchen while Diane paced back and forth. "We've done nothing wrong. Her claims won't stand up in court." "But we still have to defend ourselves," Diane pointed out. "That means lawyer fees, time away from work, stress on the kids. That's exactly what she wants, to make living here so uncomfortable that we decide to move." "We're not going anywhere," James said firmly. "This is our home now. The kids are settling in, we both love our jobs, and I refuse to let someone like Victoria Harrington dictate where we can live." The case was assigned to Judge Solomon Carter, a 68-year-old jurist with a reputation for no-nonsense rulings and zero tolerance for frivolous lawsuits. In his 30 years on the bench, he had seen every type of neighborhood dispute imaginable. But as he reviewed the case file for Harrington versus Williams, something about it raised his hackles. The preliminary hearing was set for a Monday morning. Victoria arrived in a tailored Chanel suit, her blonde hair immaculately styled, flanked by Richard Blackwood and 2 junior associates from his prestigious firm. The Williams family appeared with a single attorney, Angela Martinez, a former civil rights lawyer who now specialized in housing discrimination cases. Judge Carter entered the courtroom, his imposing figure commanding immediate respect. He surveyed the parties with keen eyes that had seen decades of human conflict. "Before we begin," he said, his deep voice filling the courtroom, "I want to make something clear. I've reviewed the filings in this case thoroughly, including the numerous noise complaints filed by Mrs. Harrington with the Homeowners Association, none of which resulted in any action. I've also reviewed the affidavits from other neighbors in Oakwood Estates, most of whom state they have never been disturbed by noise from the Williams residence." Victoria shifted uncomfortably in her seat. She hadn't expected the judge to be so prepared for this preliminary hearing. "Furthermore," Judge Carter continued, "I find it curious that in Mrs. Harrington's lengthy complaint, there is no mention of any attempts to resolve this matter directly with her neighbors before escalating to legal action. Mrs. Harrington, did you ever speak directly with the Williams family about your concerns?" Richard Blackwood stood quickly. "Your Honor, my client made numerous complaints through the proper channels." "That wasn't my question, Counselor," Judge Carter interrupted. "I asked if your client ever walked next door and had a conversation with her neighbors like a reasonable person would do." Victoria's face flushed. "I shouldn't have to." "Please stand when addressing this court, Mrs. Harrington." Judge Carter said firmly. Victoria rose, smoothing her skirt. As I was saying, Your Honor, I shouldn't have to personally confront people who are clearly violating neighborhood standards. That's why we have homeowners associations and legal remedies. Judge Carter's expression remained impassive, but something in his eyes hardened. I see. And these violations consist primarily of children playing basketball in their driveway during daylight hours and family gatherings that end well before noise ordinance hours begin. It's more than that, Victoria insisted. It's constant disruption. The character of the neighborhood. The character of the neighborhood, Judge Carter repeated slowly. Mrs. Harrington, choose your next words very carefully. Victoria hesitated, sensing the dangerous territory she was approaching. Richard Blackwood quickly intervened. Your Honor, my client is simply concerned with maintaining the peaceful environment and property values that all Oakwood Estates residents are entitled to under the HOA agreement. Judge Carter leaned back in his chair, eyes never leaving Victoria's face. I'm sure Mrs. Harrington can speak for herself, Counselor. I'd like to hear exactly what she means by the character of the neighborhood. Victoria cleared her throat. I simply mean the quiet, dignified atmosphere that attracted all of us to Oakwood Estates in the first place. The Williams family's activities have been disruptive to that atmosphere. I see, Judge Carter said, though his tone suggested he saw much more than Victoria intended to reveal. Mr. and Mrs. Williams, how would you characterize your family's activities on your property? James Williams stood, his posture straight but not rigid, his voice calm and measured. Your Honor, we're a family with 3 active teenagers. They play basketball in our driveway after completing their homework. We occasionally host family gatherings that always end by 9 p.m. on weekends. We've never received complaints from any neighbors except Mrs. Harrington. And have you taken any steps to address Mrs. Harrington's concerns? The judge asked. We've tried, Your Honor, Diane Williams answered, standing beside her husband. After the first few complaints, we spoke to our children about being mindful of noise. We moved our weekend gatherings to the backyard, further from the Harrington property. We even installed higher-quality basketball equipment with softer backboards to reduce noise. Mrs. Harrington has never spoken to us directly about her concerns. Judge Carter nodded, making a note. I'd like to schedule a full hearing for next month. In the meantime, I'm ordering both parties to attempt mediation. He fixed Victoria with a penetrating stare. And Mrs. Harrington, I strongly suggest you cease recording your neighbors without their knowledge or consent. In many contexts, that could be considered harassment. Victoria's mouth fell open in indignation. Your Honor, that's all for today, Judge Carter concluded, banging his gavel. Court is adjourned. As they gathered their belongings, Richard Blackwood leaned toward Victoria. That could have gone better. Judge Carter has a reputation for seeing through pretexts. I don't care about his reputation, Victoria hissed. I'm paying you to win this case, not make excuses. Across the aisle, Angela Martinez was conferring with the Williams family. This is a positive start, she assured them. Judge Carter clearly sees the underlying issues. The mediation order is standard procedure, but don't expect much from it. We're still open to finding a reasonable solution, James said. All we want is to live peacefully in our home. I know, Angela replied sympathetically. But I don't think peace is what Mrs. Harrington is after. The mandatory mediation session took place the following week in a conference room at the courthouse. Victoria arrived with Richard Blackwood, her face set in an expression of grim determination. The Williams family came with Angela Martinez, all 3 teenagers in tow at Angela's suggestion. I want the mediator to see the actual disruptive elements Mrs. Harrington is complaining about, she had explained. The mediator, a retired judge named Eleanor Reed, began by establishing ground rules. We're here to find a mutually acceptable solution, she explained. Both parties will have an opportunity to express their concerns, and then we'll work toward compromise. Victoria went first, presenting a carefully curated selection of video recordings showing the Williams children playing basketball, family members arriving for gatherings, and music being played during backyard parties. As you can see, she concluded, the constant noise and activity have made it impossible for me to enjoy my own home. All I'm asking is for them to behave like respectful neighbors. Judge Reed nodded and turned to the Williams family. Your response? James spoke first. We've reviewed Mrs. Harrington's videos and frankly, I'm confused about what she finds so objectionable. Our children are playing a sport in their own driveway during daylight hours. Our family gatherings are occasional and end early. The music in her recordings is barely audible. Diane added, We've made several accommodations already based on the HOA complaints, despite the fact that none were found to violate any rules. We're willing to discuss reasonable compromises, but we won't apologize for living normally in our own home. Judge Reed turned to the Williams children. Michael, as the oldest, what do you think about this situation? Michael, tall and poised like his father, spoke clearly. It's uncomfortable, ma'am. We feel watched all the time. I've started driving my siblings to the community center to play basketball instead of using our own driveway, just to avoid problems. But it doesn't seem to matter what we do. Victoria interjected. If they know they're being disruptive, why not just stop? Mrs. Harrington, Judge Reed said firmly, please don't interrupt. Michael, please continue. That's just it, Michael said. We don't believe we're being disruptive. We've lived in other neighborhoods before without any issues. It only became a problem when we moved here. Judge Reed nodded thoughtfully before turning to Zoe and Tyler, asking about their experiences. Both echoed their brother's sentiments, with Zoe adding that she had stopped inviting friends over because she felt uncomfortable being watched and recorded. After hearing from everyone, Judge Reed proposed several compromises. The Williams family would limit basketball playing to certain hours, would notify Victoria in advance of any gatherings with more than 10 guests, and would be mindful of music volume. In return, Victoria would cease recording the Williams family and direct any future concerns to the HOA rather than pursuing legal action. I find these terms unacceptable, Victoria stated flatly. They don't address the fundamental issue. Which is what exactly? Judge Reed asked. Victoria hesitated, then said, the fundamental incompatibility between our lifestyles. The mediation ended without resolution, a fact Judge Reed noted in her report to Judge Carter. When the full hearing began a month later, the courtroom was more crowded than before. Several Oakwood Estates residents had come to observe, along with a reporter from the local newspaper who had caught wind of the unusual case. Judge Carter reviewed the failed mediation report, his expression unreadable. Before we proceed, I want to address a concerning development. My clerk has informed me that several additional affidavits have been submitted by Oakwood Estates residents in support of Mrs. Harrington's claims. However, upon contacting these individuals, 3 have stated they never signed such documents. Can you explain this, Mr. Blackwood? Richard Blackwood paled visibly. Your Honor, this is the first I'm hearing of this. I would never knowingly submit falsified documents to the court. Judge Carter's gaze shifted to Victoria, who maintained an expression of innocent confusion. Mrs. Harrington, do you have any knowledge of how these affidavits came to be submitted in support of your case? Absolutely not, Your Honor, Victoria replied, her voice steady. I'm shocked to hear this. Judge Carter studied her for a long moment. We'll set that matter aside for now, but be assured it will be investigated thoroughly. Let's proceed with today's hearing. Over the next several hours, both sides presented their cases. Victoria's attorney called several witnesses, including an acoustics expert who had conducted sound measurements from Victoria's property. Though under questioning, he admitted the levels recorded fell within legal limits for residential areas. The defense called neighbors who testified they had never been bothered by noise from the Williams residence, and a psychologist who spoke about the harmful effects of racial profiling on families and children. As the hearing neared its conclusion, Judge Carter made an unexpected announcement. "Before I make my ruling, I believe it would be beneficial for me to conduct a site visit. I want to see and hear the conditions at both properties for myself. We will reconvene tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. at the Oakwood Estates entrance. Court is adjourned for today." Victoria turned to Richard, panic flickering in her eyes. "He can't do that, can he?" "He absolutely can," Richard replied grimly, "and it's not a good sign for us." The following morning dawned clear and mild. Judge Carter arrived at Oakwood Estates precisely at 9 a.m., accompanied by his clerk and a court reporter to document the proceedings. Victoria and Richard were already waiting, Victoria immaculately dressed as if for another courtroom appearance rather than a neighborhood visit. The Williams family stood a few yards away with Angela Martinez, all looking somewhat apprehensive but determined. "Good morning," Judge Carter greeted everyone. "Today's site visit will be straightforward. I'll observe both properties, inside and out, to get a first-hand understanding of the issues in question. I'll begin with the Harrington residence, then proceed to the Williams residence. I expect everyone to behave professionally. Any attempts to stage conditions or manipulate what I observe will be noted and will reflect poorly on the responsible party." Victoria led the way to her home, walking with practiced poise along the winding streets of Oakwood Estates. As they walked, Judge Carter took note of the neighborhood. Immaculate lawns, stately homes set back from the street, luxury vehicles in circular driveways. It was, by any measure, a picture of suburban affluence. "How long have you lived in Oakwood Estates, Mrs. Harrington?" Judge Carter asked conversationally. 15 years, Victoria replied proudly. "We were among the first families to build here when the development opened." "And in those 15 years, how many neighbors have you filed complaints against?" Victoria's step faltered momentarily. "I wouldn't characterize it that way, Your Honor. I've simply been proactive about maintaining neighborhood standards." "That doesn't answer my question," Judge Carter noted. "Let me be more specific. How many formal complaints or legal actions have you initiated against neighbors during your time here?" Richard Blackwood stepped closer, clearly concerned about where this line of questioning was leading. Victoria lifted her chin slightly. "I've filed HOA complaints against 7 different neighbors over the years. The Williams family is the first I've had to take legal action against." They reached Victoria's Mediterranean-style mansion, its facade gleaming in the morning sunlight. Inside, Judge Carter was led through rooms filled with expensive furniture, original artwork, and floor-to-ceiling windows that showcased carefully landscaped grounds. "This is my home office," Victoria explained, leading them into a tastefully appointed room with a desk positioned near a large window. "From here I have a direct view of the Williams property. This is where I work from home 3 days a week, and the constant noise and disruption make it virtually impossible to concentrate." Judge Carter walked to the window and looked out. The Williams driveway was clearly visible, though the basketball hoop was partially obscured by a row of perfectly trimmed hedges. "Is there another room you could use as an office?" he asked. "One that doesn't face their property?" Victoria's expression tightened. "That's hardly the point, Your Honor. I shouldn't have to rearrange my life because they refuse to respect basic neighborhood decorum." Judge Carter made a note but didn't respond directly. Instead, he asked, "Where were your previous neighbors' homes located in relation to yours?" "I don't see how that's relevant," Victoria said stiffly. "Humor me, Mrs. Harrington." After a moment's hesitation, Victoria gestured to various directions. The Patels were there, the Goldsteins there, the Rodriguez family there, the Nguyens there, the Chens. "I notice a pattern," Judge Carter interrupted quietly. "All the neighbors you filed complaints against have been families of color, is that correct?" Victoria's face flushed. That's completely irrelevant and frankly offensive, Your Honor. This has nothing to do with... Judge Carter held up a hand. Let's continue the tour, shall we? They proceeded through the rest of Victoria's home, ending in her backyard with its infinity pool and outdoor kitchen. From this vantage point, the Williams' backyard was partially visible through the privacy hedge. Have you ever been in the Williams' home, Mrs. Harrington? Judge Carter asked. Of course not, Victoria replied, as if the very idea was absurd. So you've never spoken directly with them about your concerns, never visited their home, and yet you feel qualified to make legal claims about their lifestyle and its impact on the neighborhood. Richard Blackwood intervened. Your Honor, my client has documented extensive evidence of the disruptions. Personal visitation isn't necessary to establish the facts of the case. Judge Carter nodded. Let's move on to the Williams residence. The short walk between the two properties was tense and silent. James Williams greeted them at the door of their colonial-style home, which, while impressive, was notably more modest than the Harrington mansion. Welcome, Your Honor, James said. Our home is open to you. The interior of the Williams home revealed a warm, lived-in family space. Books lined shelves in the living room, family photographs adorned the walls, and a piano sat in one corner with sheet music open on the stand. Everything was neat and clean, but clearly a home meant to be inhabited, not merely displayed. This is where we spend most of our time as a family, Diane explained, gesturing to the open concept living and dining area. The kids do homework at the dining table. We play board games here on weekend nights, that sort of thing. Judge Carter nodded, taking in the details. And where do your family gatherings typically take place? We usually set up in the backyard, James explained, leading them through French doors onto a spacious deck. We have family in the area, my sister's family and Diane's parents, who come over for Sunday dinner about twice a month. Sometimes friends join us, but it's rarely more than 15 people total. The backyard was well maintained, with a modest patio set, a grill, and garden beds along the perimeter. From this vantage point, Victoria's infinity pool was just visible through the hedge. And the basketball hoop? Judge Carter asked. This way, Michael said, leading them around to the front driveway where a regulation basketball hoop stood at the far end, the farthest point from the Harrington property. We installed this new system about 2 months ago, James explained. It has padding to reduce noise and is positioned to direct sound away from the neighbors as much as possible. Judge Carter bounced the basketball a few times, listening to the muted thud it made against the padded backboard. Do you have a specific schedule for when you play? After homework and before dinner, usually, Tyler answered. And weekend afternoons sometimes. We don't play after 8 p.m. ever, because we know sound carries more at night. Victoria, who had been silent throughout the Williams home tour, suddenly spoke up. This is all very rehearsed, Your Honor. You're not seeing how they really behave when there isn't a judge watching them. Judge Carter turned to her. Mrs. Harrington, I didn't ask for your commentary. However, since you've offered it, let me ask you this. What evidence do you have that what I'm observing today is not representative of the Williams family's normal behavior? I have dozens of videos. Yes, your recordings, Judge Carter interrupted. Made without their knowledge or consent, and which, as I've reviewed, show activities remarkably similar to what I'm observing today. Is there something specific in those recordings that contradicts what I'm seeing now? Victoria faltered. It's the cumulative effect, Your Honor. The constant coming and going, the noise, the disruption to the character of the neighborhood. Judge Carter finished for her. Yes, you've mentioned that concern repeatedly. He turned back to the Williams family. I've seen enough. Thank you for your hospitality. We'll reconvene in court tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. for my ruling. As the group disbanded, Victoria pulled Richard aside, her voice a harsh whisper. "This is a disaster. That judge has clearly already made up his mind." Richard's expression was grim. "I warned you from the beginning that this case was thin. Now, with those falsified affidavits, which I'm still waiting for an explanation about, we're in dangerous territory." "I don't know anything about falsified affidavits," Victoria insisted, though her eyes darted away as she spoke. "Find a way to fix this, Richard. That's what I pay you for." Across the street, Angela Martinez was speaking quietly with the Williams family. "I think that went as well as we could have hoped. Judge Carter saw for himself that your family's activities are normal and reasonable." "What do you think will happen tomorrow?" Diane asked, her arm around Zoe's shoulders. Angela's expression grew serious. "Based on today, I believe Judge Carter has concerns that go beyond the noise complaint itself. Be prepared for him to address what appears to be a pattern of discriminatory behavior." James nodded solemnly. "We just want this to be over so we can live in peace." "I know," Angela said, giving his arm a reassuring squeeze. "And after tomorrow, I think you'll have that chance." The courtroom was packed the following morning. Word had spread about the unusual site visit, and community interest in the case had grown. Several residents of Oakwood Estates were present, along with reporters from both the local newspaper and a regional television station. Victoria sat ramrod straight beside Richard Blackwood, her expression impassive despite the nervous tapping of her fingers against her leather portfolio. Across the aisle, the Williams family was composed, though Diane occasionally squeezed James's hand for reassurance. Judge Carter entered precisely at 9 a.m., his expression grave as he took his seat. The courtroom fell silent. "Before I deliver my ruling on Harrington versus Williams," he began, "I must address a serious matter that has come to light during these proceedings. As I mentioned yesterday, several affidavits submitted in support of Mrs. Harrington's case appear to have been falsified. I have spoken personally with the individuals whose signatures appear on these documents, and they have confirmed under oath that they did not sign them, nor did they authorize anyone to sign on their behalf." Victoria's face paled slightly, but she maintained her composed expression. "Mr. Blackwood," Judge Carter continued, "did you personally verify the authenticity of these affidavits before submitting them to this court?" Richard Blackwood stood, his discomfort evident. "Your Honor, I received these documents from my client. While I did not personally witness their signing, I had no reason to doubt their authenticity." Judge Carter's gaze shifted to Victoria. "Mrs. Harrington, please stand." Victoria rose slowly, her knuckles white as she gripped the table before her. "Mrs. Harrington, did you falsify these affidavits or knowingly submit falsified documents to this court?" A tense silence fell over the courtroom. Victoria cleared her throat. "Your Honor, I may have been overzealous in my efforts to gather support for my case. I believed my neighbors shared my concerns, but were perhaps reluctant to come forward officially." "That is not what I asked you," Judge Carter said, his voice sharp. "Did you falsify these documents?" Victoria's composure finally cracked. I drafted them based on conversations I'd had with neighbors. They expressed agreement with my concerns, so I assumed—" "You assumed you could forge their signatures and submit false testimony to this court," Judge Carter finished for her. "Mrs. Harrington, I am referring this matter to the District Attorney's Office for potential criminal charges of perjury and falsification of evidence. Additionally, I am ordering you to pay all court costs associated with this case." Murmurs swept through the courtroom. Victoria sank back into her seat, her face ashen. "Now, regarding the merits of the case itself," Judge Carter continued, "based on the evidence presented, the testimony heard, and my personal observations during yesterday's site visit, I find the following. The Williams family has not violated any noise ordinances, HOA regulations, or neighborhood covenants. Their activities, children playing basketball during daylight hours, occasional family gatherings that end at reasonable hours, normal comings and goings from their residence, are well within the bounds of reasonable behavior in a residential neighborhood. Judge Carter paused, looking directly at Victoria. Moreover, I find that Mrs. Harrington's complaints and subsequent lawsuit are not motivated by legitimate concerns about noise or property values, but rather by a pattern of discriminatory behavior that has no place in our community or our legal system. Victoria started to protest, but Richard placed a restraining hand on her arm. The evidence shows that Mrs. Harrington has filed similar complaints exclusively against neighbors of color over her 15 years in Oakwood Estates. Her own testimony and actions during these proceedings, including her repeated references to the character of the neighborhood, reveal the true nature of her objections to the Williams family. Judge Carter leaned forward, his expression stern. This court will not be used as an instrument to harass or discriminate against homeowners based on their race. Therefore, I am not only dismissing Mrs. Harrington's case with prejudice, but I am also issuing a restraining order prohibiting Mrs. Harrington from initiating any further complaints, recording the Williams family, or interfering in any way with their peaceful enjoyment of their property. He paused, looking around the courtroom. Additionally, given the egregious nature of this case and Mrs. Harrington's apparent failure to recognize the harmful impact of her actions, I am ordering her to complete 200 hours of community service with the Fair Housing Coalition, where she will receive education on housing discrimination and its effects on communities and families. Victoria gasped audibly. Richard Blackwood looked stunned. Finally, Judge Carter continued, I am awarding the Williams family $75,000 in damages, precisely the amount Mrs. Harrington sought from them, to compensate for the harassment, emotional distress, and violation of their civil rights they have endured. This amount is to be paid within 30 days. He brought his gavel down with a decisive crack. This case is dismissed. Court is adjourned. The courtroom erupted in hushed conversations as Judge Carter exited. Victoria sat frozen in her seat, her face a mask of disbelief and fury. Richard leaned over to whisper urgently in her ear, but she seemed not to hear him. Across the aisle, the Williams family embraced one another, relief evident in their expressions. Angela Martinez was smiling broadly as she gathered her documents. Congratulations, she told them quietly. This is a significant victory, not just for your family but for the community. Thank you for everything, James said, shaking her hand warmly. We couldn't have done this without you. As they turned to leave, they found themselves face to face with Victoria, who had finally risen from her seat. For a moment, the two families stood in tense silence, the aftermath of Judge Carter's ruling hanging between them. This isn't over, Victoria said, her voice low and trembling with rage. I'll appeal. I'll take this all the way to the state Supreme Court if necessary. Mrs. Harrington, Angela said calmly, I strongly advise you to accept Judge Carter's ruling. Further legal action would only compound your problems, especially given the potential criminal charges for falsifying evidence. Victoria's gaze shifted to the Williams family, her eyes cold. I built this neighborhood. People like me made it what it is. You don't belong here, and you never will. That's enough, Victoria, came a firm voice from behind her. Marcus Harrington had been sitting quietly in the back of the courtroom throughout the proceedings. Now he stepped forward, his expression a mixture of embarrassment and resolve. We're going home. Now. Marcus, you don't understand. I understand perfectly, he cut her off. I've understood for years, but I've been too much of a coward to say anything. That ends today. He turned to the Williams family. I want to apologize for my wife's behavior and for my own silence that enabled it. What she did was inexcusable. Victoria stared at her husband in shock. How dare you? We're leaving, Marcus repeated firmly, taking her arm. "Mr. and Mrs. Williams, I hope that someday we might be able to be the kind of neighbors you deserve." As the Harringtons departed, Diane turned to James with a mixture of relief and lingering concern. "Do you think it's really over?" James watched Victoria's rigid back as she exited the courtroom, her husband guiding her firmly through the doors. "I think Judge Carter's ruling made it clear what will happen if she continues down this path, and I think her husband might finally be ready to stand up to her." "We won," Michael said, still sounding slightly disbelieving. "We can just live in our house now, play basketball, have family over." "That's all we ever wanted," James agreed, putting an arm around his son's shoulders. As they left the courthouse, several reporters approached, asking for statements about the ruling. Angela fielded most of the questions professionally, but when asked how they felt about the outcome, James stepped forward. "Today, the justice system worked as it should," he said simply. "Judge Carter saw through the pretexts and recognized the true nature of this case. We're grateful for his fair and decisive ruling, and we look forward to living peacefully in our home and being good neighbors to everyone in Oakwood Estates, including the Harringtons if they're willing." The Williams family returned home to find several neighbors waiting in their driveway with flowers, bottles of wine, and homemade dishes. An older woman stepped forward as they pulled up. "I'm Margaret Chen from 3 doors down," she introduced herself. "We all wanted to welcome you properly and let you know that Victoria Harrington does not speak for this community. We're ashamed it took a lawsuit for us to say so clearly." Tears pricked at Diane's eyes as she accepted a bouquet. "Thank you. This means more than you know." Victoria stormed into their mansion, flinging her designer handbag onto the marble entryway table with such force that a crystal vase toppled and shattered on the floor. Marcus followed more slowly, closing the door behind him with deliberate calm that only seemed to fuel his wife's rage. "How could you humiliate me like that?" she demanded, whirling to face him. "In front of everyone, apologizing to those people as if I'd done something wrong." Marcus surveyed the broken glass scattered across the imported Italian tile, then met his wife's gaze steadily. "You did do something wrong, Victoria. You've been doing something wrong for years, and I've been complicit by staying silent." "Don't be ridiculous," she scoffed. "Everything I've done has been to protect our investment, our way of life. This neighborhood—" "Stop," Marcus interrupted, his voice firmer than Victoria had heard it in years. "Just stop. This has nothing to do with property values or neighborhood character or noise violations. We both know exactly what this is about, and it's time to be honest about it." Victoria's face flushed. "If you're implying—" "I'm not implying anything. I'm stating it plainly. You targeted the Williams family because they're black, just like you targeted the Patels because they're Indian and the Nguyens because they're Vietnamese. I've watched you do this for 15 years, and I've said nothing because it was easier to look the other way." Victoria stared at him, momentarily speechless. In their 27 years of marriage, Marcus had never confronted her so directly. "I don't have to listen to this," she finally said, turning toward the sweeping staircase. "I'm calling Patricia. She'll recommend a good appellate attorney." "No, you're not," Marcus said, his tone stopping her mid-step. "There will be no appeal. You heard Judge Carter. You're facing potential criminal charges for falsifying those affidavits. An appeal would only make things worse." Victoria turned back slowly. "You can't be serious. You expect me to just accept this? To pay those people $75,000? To do community service like some common criminal?" "Yes," Marcus said simply. "That's exactly what I expect, because those are the consequences of your actions. And frankly, you got off lightly. Judge Carter could have referred you for criminal prosecution immediately rather than just forwarding the evidence to the DA." He sighed, suddenly looking tired. "Victoria, We need to talk about what happens next, not just with the Williams family or this ruling, but with us." Something in his tone made Victoria's anger falter. "What do you mean?" "I mean that I can't continue like this. Watching you destroy people's lives and peace of mind because they don't fit your narrow vision of who belongs in our neighborhood. Making excuses for behavior I know is wrong. I've become someone I don't recognize, and I want that to change." Victoria's expression hardened again. "If you're threatening to leave me over this—" "I'm not threatening anything," Marcus interrupted. "I'm telling you that things need to change, starting with how you treat the Williams family and other neighbors who don't look like us. And yes, if they don't change, I will have to reconsider our marriage." He walked past her, carefully avoiding the broken glass, and headed toward his study. "I'll transfer the $75,000 to the Williams family's attorney tomorrow. I suggest you start thinking about how you're going to approach your community service hours." Victoria stood alone in the entryway, surrounded by shards of crystal that caught the afternoon sunlight streaming through the windows. For the first time in years, perhaps decades, she felt uncertain about her path forward. Across the hedge, the impromptu gathering at the Williams home had evolved into a celebration. Neighbors who had previously been too intimidated by Victoria to reach out were now introducing themselves, sharing stories, and expressing relief that Judge Carter had seen through her case. "She tried the same thing when we moved in 5 years ago," Lakshmi Patel was explaining to Diane as they sat on the back deck. "Complaints about cooking smells, about our children playing too loudly. She even called code enforcement when my husband's parents visited from India and stayed with us for 2 months." "How did you handle it?" Diane asked. Lakshmi smiled wryly. "We installed better kitchen ventilation, created a soundproofed playroom for the children, and showed the code enforcement officer the guest suite we'd built specifically for extended family visits. Eventually, she moved on to harassing the Chen family instead." Margaret Chen nodded, sipping her iced tea. "We learned to ignore her, but it was stressful. You're the first family who's actually stood up to her legally. Most of us just tried to stay out of her way." "We didn't want to file a lawsuit," James explained, joining the conversation. "We tried to address her complaints, make reasonable accommodations, but nothing was ever enough." "That's her pattern," another neighbor, David Goldman, chimed in. "The goalposts always move because the real issue isn't noise or property values or whatever she claims. It's who she thinks belongs here and who doesn't." As the afternoon wore on, the gathering took on a deeper significance than merely celebrating the court victory. Neighbors exchanged contact information, made plans for future get-togethers, and began forming the genuine community connections that Victoria's influence had long suppressed. Michael, Zoe, and Tyler had invited several neighborhood kids to play basketball in the driveway. The sound of their laughter and the rhythmic bounce of the ball seemed to symbolize the freedom the family now felt to simply exist in their own space without constant scrutiny. Angela Martinez, who had stayed to join the celebration, found James alone for a moment on the side deck, watching the teenagers play. "This is what it should have been like from the beginning," she said, gesturing to the scene of neighborhood camaraderie unfolding around them. James nodded. "It's ironic. Victoria wanted to isolate us, but her lawsuit ended up bringing the whole neighborhood together." "That often happens," Angela replied. "People like Victoria rely on others staying silent, looking the other way. Once someone challenges them openly, it creates space for everyone to speak up." "Do you think she'll really leave us alone now?" James asked, the concern still evident in his voice. Angela considered this. The restraining order gives her strong legal incentive to back off. The potential criminal charges for falsifying evidence provide even more motivation. But ultimately, it will depend on whether she's capable of self-reflection and change. "And if she's not? Then we'll be ready," Angela assured him. "The law is on your side, and now so are your neighbors. That's a powerful combination. Inside the house, Diane was showing a group of women the home office she had set up in one of the spare bedrooms, where she worked on her academic writing and prepared lectures. "I love how you've arranged this space," Margaret Chen commented, admiring the built-in bookshelves filled with literature and academic texts. "So warm and functional." "Thank you," Diane said. "It's where I wrote my last book on contemporary African-American poets. I'm working on a new one now about literary responses to housing discrimination throughout the 20th century. "How fitting," Lakshmi noted with a smile. "Perhaps this experience will find its way into your work." "It already has," Diane admitted, "though I never expected to have such personal material to draw from." As evening approached, the gathering began to disperse, neighbors returning to their homes with promises to stay in touch and plans for future block parties and community events. The Williams family stood in their driveway, waving goodbye to the last guests. "Well," James said, his arm around Diane's shoulders, "that wasn't how I expected this day to go." "It was better," Diane replied, leaning into his embrace. "So much better than I could have imagined." "Can we play basketball whenever we want now?" Tyler asked, still holding the ball under his arm. James ruffled his youngest son's hair. "Within reason, yes. No midnight games on school nights. But we don't have to worry about Mrs. Harrington watching and recording us anymore?" Zoe clarified. "No," James assured her. "Judge Carter made that very clear. This is our home, and we have every right to enjoy it." As they headed back inside, Michael paused, looking across at the Harrington mansion where a single light burned in what they now knew was Marcus Harrington's study. "Do you think they'll ever just be normal neighbors?" he asked his parents. James and Diane exchanged glances. "I don't know," James answered honestly. "But Mr. Harrington's apology today seemed genuine. People can change if they want to badly enough." "And if they don't?" Michael pressed. Diane smiled at her thoughtful eldest son. "Then we'll continue living our lives with dignity and joy, regardless of what they think or do. That's its own kind of victory." 3 weeks after Judge Carter's ruling, Victoria sat stiffly in a fluorescent-lit conference room at the Fair Housing Coalition headquarters downtown. The building was modest compared to the gleaming corporate offices she typically frequented. A converted warehouse with exposed brick walls and mismatched furniture that had been donated or purchased secondhand. Everything about it made Victoria uncomfortable, from the earnest young staffers in casual clothing to the wall of photos showing families of various ethnicities holding keys to their new homes. "Mrs. Harrington, thank you for coming in today," said Elaine Jackson, the coalition's executive director, a black woman in her 50s with close-cropped silver hair and penetrating dark eyes. "I understand you're here to fulfill community service hours ordered by Judge Carter." Victoria nodded curtly. 200 hours. I'd like to get them completed as quickly as possible." Elaine's expression remained neutral, though her eyes reflected a knowing assessment. "Community service isn't about checking boxes or racing through hours, Mrs. Harrington. It's about meaningful engagement and hopefully growth." "I'm aware of the standard platitudes," Victoria replied. "However, I have a business to run and other obligations that require my attention." Elaine studied her for a moment, then nodded. "I see. Well, let me explain how we'll structure your time with us. You'll rotate through several departments: our housing discrimination hotline, tenant advocacy, community education, and our legal aid clinic. Each placement will give you a different perspective on housing discrimination and its impacts." Victoria's expression tightened. "Is that really necessary? Surely there's administrative work I could do instead, filing, data entry, that sort of thing." "I'm afraid not," Elaine said firmly. Judge Carter was quite specific in his order. "Your service is to include direct engagement with our mission and the communities we serve." She slid a folder across the table. Here's your schedule for the next few weeks. You'll start tomorrow on the Housing Discrimination Hotline. Maria Gonzalez will be your supervisor." Victoria opened the folder, her lips pressing into a thin line as she scanned the schedule. "This requires me to be here 3 days a week." Yes, that was the minimum frequency that would allow you to complete your hours within a reasonable time frame while still maintaining the quality of engagement Judge Carter specified. Victoria closed the folder with a sharp snap. "Fine. I'll be here at 9 tomorrow morning." As she gathered her designer handbag and stood to leave, Elaine remained seated, her calm gaze unwavering. "Mrs. Harrington, may I offer some advice?" Victoria paused reluctantly. "What?" "The next 200 hours will be whatever you choose to make of them. You can view this as punishment to be endured, or you can approach it as an opportunity to expand your understanding. One path will make the time drag unbearably. The other might actually lead to something valuable." Victoria didn't respond, but Elaine's words followed her as she walked briskly to her Mercedes in the coalition's modest parking lot. The very idea that she needed her understanding expanded was insulting. She was a successful businesswoman who had navigated complex real estate deals worth millions. What could she possibly learn from a small non-profit organization with furniture that belonged in a thrift store? She drove home in a simmering state of resentment, mentally cataloging all the productive things she could be doing instead of wasting time on this court-ordered charade. When she arrived home, she was surprised to find Marcus's car in the driveway. He typically worked late at his investment firm, especially in recent weeks, as they had barely spoken to each other. Inside, she found him in the kitchen, a room she rarely entered herself, as they employed a housekeeper who handled meal preparation. He was making a sandwich, his suit jacket draped over a chair and his tie loosened. "You're home early," she observed, setting her purse on the counter. "I had some things to take care of here," he replied, not looking up from his task. "How was your meeting at the Fair Housing Coalition?" Victoria's expression soured. Predictably self-righteous, the director practically lectured me about meaningful engagement and expanding my understanding. Marcus finished making his sandwich and finally looked at her. "Is that such a terrible concept?" "Don't you start too," Victoria snapped. "I've already written the check to the Williams family. Isn't that enough?" "Apparently not, since you also falsified legal documents and harassed a family to the point where a judge felt a restraining order was necessary," Marcus replied evenly. "The money addresses the harm you caused them. The community service is about preventing you from causing similar harm in the future." Victoria stared at him, unused to this direct challenge from her typically acquiescent husband. "Whose side are you on?" "I'm on the side of doing what's right," Marcus said, picking up his plate. "Something I should have been more vocal about years ago." He turned to leave the kitchen, then paused. "By the way, I've invited James and Diane Williams to dinner next week." Victoria's jaw dropped. "You what?" "You heard me. If we're going to be neighbors, we should at least try to establish a civil relationship. Judge Carter's ruling doesn't mean we have to avoid each other forever." "Have you lost your mind?" "After everything that's happened." "Yes, after everything that's happened," Marcus interrupted firmly. "Especially after everything that's happened. It's time to move forward, Victoria. I've scheduled the dinner for Wednesday at 7. The restraining order permits social contact initiated by us and agreed to by them, which this is." "And if I refuse to participate?" Victoria challenged. Marcus met her gaze steadily. "Then you'll miss what I expect will be an illuminating evening. But the dinner will proceed either way." He left the kitchen, leaving Victoria speechless for the second time that day. Across the hedge, life in the Williams household had settled into a new rhythm. The children played basketball in the driveway without constantly looking over their shoulders. Diane worked in her home office with the windows open, enjoying the spring breeze. James came home from long hospital shifts to a house that felt truly like a sanctuary. The $75,000 check from the Harringtons had arrived precisely on the deadline Judge Carter had set. After discussion, the family had decided to donate most of it to organizations supporting fair housing and educational opportunities for underserved communities, keeping only enough to cover their legal expenses. "Mom, you won't believe what happened today," Zoe exclaimed as she bounded into the kitchen where Diane was preparing dinner. "Mrs. Harrington actually nodded at me when I was walking home from the bus stop." Diane raised her eyebrows. "Nodded? As in, acknowledged your existence?" "I know, right? It wasn't exactly friendly, more like stiff, I guess. But better than the death glare she usually gives us." James looked up from where he was setting the table. "That's progress, I suppose. Small steps." "Oh, and Mr. Harrington stopped his car to talk to me," Zoe continued. "He asked if we got the invitation to dinner at their house next week. I told him we did, but that you guys haven't decided yet." James and Diane exchanged glances. The formal dinner invitation had arrived 2 days prior, handwritten on expensive stationery. They had been discussing it, but hadn't reached a decision. "What do you think about it?" Diane asked Zoe, curious about her daughter's perspective. Zoe considered the question seriously. "I think it's weird and probably super awkward, but also, maybe important. Mr. Harrington seems like he's really trying." "That's my take as well," James agreed. "Uncomfortable, but potentially valuable." Michael entered the kitchen, having overheard the conversation. "Are we seriously considering having dinner with the woman who tried to drive us out of the neighborhood and falsified legal documents against us?" "We're considering having dinner with our neighbors," Diane corrected gently, "including a woman who did those things but who might be capable of change, and a man who publicly apologized for enabling her behavior. Plus," James added, "the invitation specifically mentioned that Victoria has begun her community service at the Fair Housing Coalition. That couldn't have been easy for her to include in the note." "So we're going?" Michael asked, still sounding skeptical. James looked at Diane, who nodded slightly. "Yes, I think we are. But we'll go as a family, all of us together." "Even us kids?" Tyler asked, joining the conversation as he entered with a basketball tucked under his arm. "Especially you kids," Diane confirmed. "This affects all of us, and we face it together." Later that evening, after the children had gone to bed, James found Diane sitting on their bedroom balcony, gazing thoughtfully toward the Harrington mansion. "Having second thoughts?" he asked, joining her. "Not second thoughts exactly," she replied. "Just wondering what we're walking into. Do you really think Victoria Harrington is capable of change?" James considered this. "I think everyone is capable of change under the right circumstances. Whether she'll choose that path remains to be seen. But Marcus seems genuinely determined to make amends, and that's a start." Diane leaned her head against his shoulder. "It's strange. A month ago, we were preparing for court, worried about being forced out of our home. Now we're contemplating dinner with the very people who caused all that stress." "Life takes unexpected turns," James said, putting his arm around her. "But I believe in giving people a chance to do better, to be better. Not endlessly, and not without accountability, but at least once." Diane smiled up at him. "That's one of the many reasons I love you. Your capacity for forgiveness has always been greater than mine." "Not forgiveness yet," James clarified. "Just openness to the possibility of a new chapter. The rest remains to be seen." Victoria's first day at the Fair Housing Coalition began with a mandatory orientation session led by Maria Gonzalez, a woman in her mid-30s with a no-nonsense demeanor and a wealth of knowledge about housing discrimination that she seemed determined to impart whether Victoria was interested or not. "The hotline receives approximately 30 calls per day," Maria explained, as she led Victoria to a small cubicle equipped with a headset and computer. People contact us when they believe they've experienced housing discrimination. Your job will be to listen, record the details of their situation, and provide basic information about their rights. Victoria eyed the worn office chair with distaste. And what qualifies me to advise people on housing discrimination? Maria smiled thinly. Nothing at present. That's why you'll be following a script and referring complex cases to our legal team. You'll also be shadowing me for the first week before handling calls independently. The morning passed in a blur of calls that left Victoria increasingly uncomfortable. A young black couple described being told an apartment was no longer available, only to have their white friend inquire an hour later and be offered a showing. An elderly Vietnamese man explained how his landlord refused to make repairs while promptly addressing identical issues in other units. A single mother detailed how a property manager asked invasive questions about her children's father and her income sources in ways that violated fair housing laws. During a brief lunch break, Victoria sat alone in the small break room, absently stirring a cup of coffee she had no intention of drinking. The conversations she'd observed all morning had stirred something unsettling within her. Not compassion exactly, but a creeping discomfort she couldn't quite name. Maria entered, microwaving a container of homemade soup. "How are you finding it so far?" Victoria straightened her posture, reflexively adopting the poised, controlled demeanor she presented to the world. "It's been informative." "That's one word for it," Maria acknowledged, sitting across from Victoria with her soup. "Most people find their first day on the hotline eye-opening." "These people on the phone," Victoria began carefully. "How do you know they're telling the truth? Couldn't they be exaggerating or misinterpreting normal business decisions?" Maria considered this. "Some might be. That's why we investigate before taking legal action. But after doing this work for 12 years, I can tell you that most callers underreport discrimination rather than exaggerate it. Many have convinced themselves that there must be some other explanation because the truth is too painful to acknowledge." Victoria was silent for a moment, stirring her coffee again. "The couple this morning, the ones looking for an apartment, their situation reminded me of something." "Oh?" Maria prompted when Victoria didn't continue. "Years ago, I owned a small apartment building, one of my first investments. My property manager used to tell me certain applicants weren't a good fit for the building. I never questioned what that meant. I assumed he was screening for income stability, rental history, that sort of thing." Maria's expression remained neutral, but her eyes reflected understanding. "And now?" Victoria met her gaze briefly before looking away. "Now I'm wondering what criteria he was actually using." The afternoon brought more calls, including one that hit uncomfortably close to home, a complaint about a homeowners association that seemed to enforce rules selectively depending on residents' backgrounds. Victoria found herself unable to maintain her detached professionalism as the caller described receiving violation notices for issues that white neighbors were never cited for. "It's like they're looking for any excuse to make us feel unwelcome," the caller said, her voice thick with frustration. By the end of the day, Victoria was mentally exhausted. As she gathered her belongings, Elaine Jackson appeared in the doorway of the small cubicle. "How was your first day, Mrs. Harrington?" Victoria paused. "Busier than I expected." Elaine nodded. "The need is great. Many people face housing discrimination without even recognizing it as such. Others recognize it but don't know they have legal recourse." "Yes, well," Victoria replied, slipping her designer purse over her arm. "I've certainly heard many perspectives today." "That's a start," Elaine said. "We'll see you tomorrow." The week progressed with Victoria gradually taking on more responsibility with the hotline calls. Despite her initial reluctance, she found herself becoming invested in certain cases. particularly one involving an elderly widow being pressured to sell her home below market value by a developer using intimidation tactics. Victoria's extensive real estate knowledge proved unexpectedly valuable as she helped the woman understand her options. "You have a good instinct for the technical aspects of these cases," Maria observed after that call. "When you actually listen to people, you can be quite helpful." Victoria wasn't sure if this was a compliment or a criticism, but she found herself oddly pleased nonetheless. At home, preparations for the dinner with the Williams family occupied much of Victoria's attention. She had initially considered refusing to participate, but Marcus's quiet determination had made it clear that this event would proceed with or without her cooperation. Better to maintain some control over the situation, she decided, than to abdicate it entirely. She supervised the housekeeper's cleaning with unusual thoroughness, selected the menu with careful consideration after discreetly inquiring about any dietary restrictions through Marcus, and even purchased new table linens for the occasion. If this dinner was inevitable, it would at least meet her exacting standards. Wednesday evening arrived with a palpable tension in the Harrington household. Victoria had changed outfits 3 times before settling on a conservative navy blue dress that projected dignified elegance without ostentation. Marcus, observing her nervous preparations with interest, had never seen his wife so uncertain about a social gathering. "They're just people, Victoria," he remarked as he adjusted his tie in the bedroom mirror. "Successful, educated people who happen to be our neighbors." "I'm well aware of who they are," Victoria replied tersely. "I simply want everything to be appropriate." Marcus turned to face her. "Appropriate for whom? For them? For you? Or for the image you want to project?" Before Victoria could formulate a response, the doorbell rang. She smoothed her dress, took a deep breath, and followed Marcus downstairs. The Williams family stood on the doorstep, all 5 of them dressed in smart casual attire that managed to be both respectful of the occasion and true to their personal styles. James held a bottle of wine, Diane carried a bouquet of flowers, and the children displayed varying degrees of apprehension and curiosity. "Welcome," Marcus greeted them warmly, stepping aside to usher them in. "Thank you for coming." Victoria stood slightly behind him, her expression carefully controlled. "Yes, welcome to our home." The initial moments were as awkward as everyone had anticipated. The Williams children remained close to their parents, answering direct questions politely, but volunteering nothing. Victoria maintained a hostess demeanor that was correct but distant. Only Marcus seemed genuinely at ease, giving them a brief tour of the main floor before leading everyone to the formal dining room where the table had been impeccably set. "Your home is beautiful," Diane offered as they took their seats, her academic's eye noting the carefully curated artwork and furniture. "That's an original Edward Mitchell banister in the hallway, isn't it? His landscapes are extraordinary." Victoria looked surprised. "Yes, it is. We acquired it at auction last year." "Bannister's story is fascinating," Diane continued. "He won first prize at the Philadelphia Centennial Exposition in 1876, but when the judges realized he was black, they tried to rescind the award." "I didn't know that," Victoria admitted, genuinely taken aback. "The provenance documentation didn't mention it." "It wouldn't," Diane said with a small smile. "His accomplishments were often documented while his race was conveniently omitted." The dinner service began, temporarily shifting focus to the elaborate meal prepared by Victoria's personal chef. Conversation remained stilted until Tyler, the youngest Williams child, looked up from his plate with wide eyes. "This chicken is amazing," he exclaimed with unfiltered enthusiasm. "It's even better than when Dad grills it, and that's saying something." The spontaneous compliment broke some of the tension, drawing a genuine laugh from Marcus and a startled smile from Victoria. "Thank you," she said. "I'll be sure to tell Chef Anton you enjoyed it." "Do you cook, Mrs. Harrington?" Zoe asked, emboldened by her brother's ice-breaking comment. Victoria shook her head. Not really. I never quite found the time to learn properly. Mom's teaching me, Zoe offered. She says cooking is chemistry, history, and art all mixed together. An interesting perspective, Victoria replied, finding herself actually curious. What do you like to cook? As Zoe described her culinary experiments, the conversation gradually began to flow more naturally. James discussed his work at the hospital, finding common ground with Marcus, who served on the board of another medical center. Michael, initially the most reserved, became animated when discussing his interest in architecture, which connected unexpectedly with Victoria's knowledge of historical buildings from her real estate work. By the time dessert was served, the atmosphere had transformed from rigid formality to something approaching comfortable conversation among neighbors. Not friends. The history between them was too complex for that. But people capable of sharing a meal and finding points of connection despite their differences. After the Williams family departed, Victoria found herself standing in the kitchen, absently directing the housekeeper's cleanup efforts while reflecting on the evening. The dinner had gone better than she'd expected. No heated confrontations, no awkward references to the lawsuit, just a civil meal between neighbors. Yet something about it left her unsettled. They're actually quite accomplished, she said aloud, not realizing Marcus had entered the kitchen behind her. Did you expect otherwise? He asked, loosening his tie. Victoria turned, flustered at being caught in her moment of reflection. I didn't have any particular expectations. Yes, you did. Marcus contradicted gently. You expected them to confirm your preconceptions. Instead, you discovered that Diane Williams has published 3 books. James is pioneering a new surgical technique, and their children are thoughtful, well-spoken young people with clear goals and interests. Victoria busied herself adjusting a vase of flowers. I never said they weren't intelligent. You never said it, but you treated them as if their presence somehow diminished the neighborhood. Marcus poured himself a small glass of bourbon. Be honest, Victoria. If the Williams family were white, would you have ever filed those noise complaints? The question hung in the air between them, a challenge Victoria wasn't ready to answer. Instead, she murmured something about needing to prepare for another day at the Fair Housing Coalition and retreated upstairs, Marcus's words following her like an accusation. The next morning found Victoria back at her community service placement, this time assigned to shadow Ramon Diaz in the tenant advocacy department. Ramon was a former tenant organizer who now coordinated the coalition's efforts to educate renters about their rights and assist with landlord-tenant disputes. Today we're visiting Parkview Apartments, Ramon explained as they drove to the east side of the city. The building was recently purchased by Westbrook Properties. They've been systematically pushing out long-term tenants to renovate units and double the rent. Victoria shifted uncomfortably in the passenger seat. Westbrook Properties is a reputable development company. I've worked with them on several projects. Ramon glanced at her. Then you probably know their business model relies on acquiring undervalued properties in neighborhoods on the cusp of gentrification, displacing existing residents, and marketing luxury upgrades to a completely different demographic. It's called revitalization, Victoria countered defensively. Those buildings are often in disrepair and poorly managed before companies like Westbrook step in. And whose fault is that? Ramon asked. The tenants who have no control over maintenance decisions, or the previous landlords who deliberately neglected repairs to devalue the property for a cheap sale? Victoria fell silent, recognizing uncomfortably that she had facilitated exactly such transactions in her own business dealings. Parkview Apartments was a modest mid-century building with a faded brick exterior. Despite signs of age, the property was clean and well-maintained by the tenants themselves, many of whom had lived there for decades. Ramon led Victoria to a community room where about 20 residents had gathered, most of them elderly and all appearing anxious. Ms. Ortiz, thank you for organizing today's meeting. Ramon greeted an elegant woman in her 70s. This is Victoria Harrington. She's volunteering with the coalition and will be observing today. Victoria nodded stiffly, acutely aware of being the only white person in the room and uncomfortable with Ramon's charitable characterization of her court-ordered service as volunteering. Ms. Ortiz eyed Victoria skeptically before turning back to Ramon. They've started with the notices. 7 units so far, all on the 4th floor, 30 days to vacate, with a generous relocation offer of $1,000. Her voice dripped with sarcasm at the word generous. Ramon shook his head. That's not nearly enough to cover moving costs and new security deposits in today's market. It's legal, though, Victoria found herself saying. 30 days' notice is standard for month-to-month tenants. The room fell silent, all eyes turning to her. Legal doesn't make it right, Ms. Ortiz replied firmly. My husband and I have lived in this building for 32 years. We raised our children here. We've never missed a rent payment. Now we're being told to leave because someone decided our home would be more profitable without us in it. Victoria felt a familiar defensive response rising within her. Explanations about market forces and property rights. But something stopped her. Perhaps it was the dignity in Ms. Ortiz's steady gaze, or the memories of similar stories she'd heard on the housing discrimination hotline over the past week. Whatever the reason, Victoria remained silent as the meeting continued. Ramon outlined tenants' rights and potential strategies for negotiation with Westbrook Properties. Victoria listened with growing discomfort as she recognized tactics she had advised clients to use, offering inadequate relocation assistance, scheduling repairs at inconvenient times to disturb long-term residents, selectively enforcing lease provisions against certain tenants, but not others. When the meeting ended, Victoria found herself lingering as residents approached Ramon with individual questions. Ms. Ortiz appeared at her side. You work in real estate, don't you? The older woman asked perceptively. I can tell by the way you talk. Developer? Victoria nodded reluctantly. I have a company that specializes in neighborhood revitalization projects. Ms. Ortiz smiled without humor. Revitalization. Such a nice word for what happens to communities like ours. She gestured around the room. Look at these people, Mrs. Harrington. When Westbrook doubles the rent, where do you think we'll go? What happens to the networks of support we've built here? The neighbors who check on each other? The community gardens we've tended for decades? Victoria had no answer. She had never considered these questions when evaluating a property's investment potential. On the drive back to the coalition office, Victoria remained unusually quiet, processing what she had witnessed. Ramon seemed content to let her think, only speaking when they were nearly back. You know, Westbrook's CEO is on the coalition's donor list, he remarked. Gives $25,000 every year to our annual gala. Says all the right things about affordable housing while his company displaces hundreds of families annually. Victoria looked at him sharply. Why are you telling me this? Because I think you're starting to understand the difference between what's legal and what's right, Ramon replied. And that's the first step toward meaningful change. That evening, Victoria found herself researching Parkview Apartments and Westbrook Properties development plans. The company's investor materials painted a glowing picture of revitalized urban living and premium amenities for discerning residents. Nowhere did they mention what would happen to the existing tenants, many of whom had been photographed by Ramon standing proudly in front of the building they had called home for decades. Her phone rang, interrupting her research. It was James Williams. Dr. Williams, she answered, surprised. Is everything all right? Everything's fine, James assured her. I wanted to thank you for dinner last night. It was an important step forward. Victoria hesitated. It was Marcus's idea, she admitted. I know, James replied. But you participated, and that matters. Look, Victoria, May I call you Victoria? I don't expect us to become best friends. There's too much history for that. But I do think we can find a way to be neighbors who respect each other's right to exist peacefully. The simple reasonableness of his statement caught Victoria off guard. That seems fair. Good. James paused. There's something else. Marcus mentioned you're serving your community service hours at the Fair Housing Coalition. Victoria tensed. Yes, that's correct. My mother serves on their board, James said. She mentioned they're working on a campaign to address displacement in development projects. Given your expertise, you might have valuable insights to contribute. Victoria was momentarily speechless. This was the last thing she had expected from James Williams. Not recrimination or gloating over her punishment, but an invitation to apply her professional knowledge in a constructive way. I'm not sure they'd welcome my input, she finally responded. Why not ask? James suggested. You might be surprised. Elaine Jackson is a pragmatist. She knows that meaningful change requires engaging with people on all sides of the issue. After they hung up, Victoria sat with her laptop open to the Westbrook Properties investor presentation, thinking about Ms. Ortiz and the other Parkview residents. For the first time in her career, she found herself considering a development project not just from the investor's perspective but from the viewpoint of those whose lives would be upended by it. It was an uncomfortable position for someone who had built her success on identifying underperforming properties and transforming them into luxury developments. Yet she couldn't unsee the human impact of what she had previously viewed as simply good business. Victoria closed her laptop and moved to the window overlooking her manicured backyard. Beyond the privacy hedge, she could see lights on in the Williams home and the silhouettes of the family moving about their evening routines. Normal people living normal lives, just as she and Marcus did. They're not so different from us, she murmured to herself, the admission both simple and profound. 2 months into her community service, Victoria sat in Elaine Jackson's office, a proposal spread across the desk between them. What had begun as a court-ordered punishment had evolved into something Victoria herself wouldn't have predicted: meaningful engagement. Your analysis of predatory development practices is surprisingly candid, Elaine remarked, reviewing Victoria's detailed report, especially coming from someone who has utilized many of these tactics. Victoria winced slightly but didn't deny it. That's precisely why I understand how they work. These aren't strategies developers advertise publicly, but they're standard practice in the industry. The report, titled Beyond Gentrification, Ethical Development Alternatives, outlined common displacement tactics and proposed countermeasures, including community benefit agreements, tenant right of first refusal options, and strategic use of land trusts to preserve affordable housing. Victoria had spent weeks researching and writing it, drawing on both her extensive industry knowledge and her new understanding of housing discrimination's human impact. What prompted this? Elaine asked, her shrewd eyes studying Victoria carefully. This goes well beyond your required service hours. Victoria considered the question, wanting to give an honest answer. The Parkview Apartments visit with Ramon was eye-opening. I realized I've spent my career viewing properties as investment vehicles, not as people's homes. When Ms. Ortiz asked where she and her neighbors would go after being displaced, I had no answer. That bothered me more than I expected. She paused, organizing her thoughts. I'm good at what I do, Elaine. I understand real estate development inside and out. But I've been using that expertise in ways that hurt communities rather than help them. I thought maybe I could apply the same knowledge differently. Elaine leaned back, her expression thoughtful. You've surprised me, Victoria. When Judge Carter sent you to us, I expected resistance, not collaboration. Believe me, no one is more surprised than I am, Victoria admitted with a wry smile that would have been unimaginable 2 months earlier. I came here intending to check boxes and complete my hours, I didn't expect to. She hesitated, struggling to articulate the complex shift in her perspective. To see people as people? Elaine suggested gently. Victoria nodded, the simple truth of it both uncomfortable and liberating. Yes. Your proposals are ambitious, Elaine said, returning to the document. Particularly this section on developer accountability. What made you focus on that? Because that's where I've seen the most egregious behavior, Victoria explained. Developers make promises to communities during approval processes, affordable housing units, green spaces, local hiring, that mysteriously disappear in the final execution. There's rarely any consequence for these broken promises. Elaine studied her with new interest. Are you suggesting we need better enforcement mechanisms? Absolutely. Binding community benefit agreements with financial penalties for non-compliance, regular public audits of development outcomes versus promises, and resident oversight committees with real authority. Victoria's voice had taken on the confident tone she typically reserved for business presentations. These aren't radical ideas, they're practical accountability measures. That may be, Elaine agreed, but they would represent a significant shift in how development occurs in this city. The pushback from your colleagues in the industry would be substantial. Victoria's expression hardened slightly. Let them push back. I know every argument they'll make because I've made them myself. I also know the holes in those arguments. Elaine smiled, a genuine warmth reaching her eyes. Victoria Harrington, housing justice advocate. I must admit, I didn't see that coming. Neither did I, Victoria admitted. But here we are. As she left the coalition office that afternoon, Victoria felt a curious sense of satisfaction that had been missing from her professional life for longer than she cared to acknowledge. Her work in real estate had brought her wealth and status, but this, using her expertise to protect vulnerable communities rather than exploit them, provided a different kind of fulfillment. Driving home, she found herself taking a detour past Parkview Apartments. A group of residents was gathered in the small courtyard, tending to raised garden beds bursting with summer vegetables and flowers. She recognized Ms. Ortiz directing the activity, her dignified presence commanding respect despite her diminutive stature. Victoria parked her car and approached hesitantly, aware of how out of place she looked in her designer suit and heels among the gardeners in their practical clothing. Mrs. Harrington? Ms. Ortiz greeted her, surprise evident in her voice. What brings you here? I wanted to tell you that the coalition is working on a response to Westbrook Properties development plan, Victoria explained. We're particularly focused on protecting long-term residents like yourself. Ms. Ortiz's eyebrows rose at Victoria's use of we, but she nodded appreciatively. Thank you for letting us know. Would you like to see our community garden? We've been maintaining it for 20 years. The invitation was unexpected but welcome. Victoria followed Ms. Ortiz through the neat rows of tomatoes, peppers, and herbs, listening as the older woman explained their communal approach to gardening and food sharing. Everyone contributes according to their ability and takes according to their need, Ms. Ortiz explained. Mr. Chen can't bend to weed anymore because of his back, but he's an excellent cook who prepares meals with our harvest. Mrs. Lopez has arthritis in her hands but can still water. We work together. Victoria took in the thriving garden and the evident pride of the residents tending it. This would all be lost under Westbrook's development plan, she realized aloud. Yes, Ms. Ortiz confirmed simply. Not everything valuable appears on a balance sheet, Mrs. Harrington. The statement stayed with Victoria as she continued home, her mind working through potential strategies to protect the Parkview community. By the time she pulled into her driveway, the outline of a new approach was forming in her mind, one that would require all her business acumen and newfound ethical perspective. She was so absorbed in her thoughts that she almost didn't notice Michael Williams shooting baskets in his driveway. He paused as she exited her car, basketball held tentatively against his hip as if unsure whether to continue playing or retreat inside. "Good afternoon, Michael," Victoria called, making a conscious decision to acknowledge him. "You have excellent form on your jump shot." The teenager looked momentarily startled before recovering. "Thanks, Mrs. Harrington. I've been working on it." "It shows," she replied, then added, "I hope the noise ordinance issue isn't still concerning you. You have every right to play in your own driveway." A cautious smile appeared on Michael's face. "It's fine now. Actually, Mr. Harrington came over last weekend and helped us adjust the backboard to make it even quieter. It was cool of him." Victoria hadn't known about this neighborly gesture from her husband. That was thoughtful of him. "Yeah, he knows a lot about basketball. Said he played in college." "He did," Victoria confirmed, a memory surfacing of young Marcus in his university jersey, passionate about a game she had never taken the time to understand. "He was quite good, actually." Michael bounced the ball contemplatively. "Maybe he could give me some tips sometime. I'm trying out for varsity this fall." "I'm sure he'd like that," Victoria replied, surprised to find she meant it. Inside her house, Victoria found Marcus in his study reviewing investment reports. He looked up as she entered, surprised by her earlier than usual return from the coalition. "You're home early," he observed. "I had something I wanted to discuss with you," she said, settling into the leather chair across from his desk. "I saw you've been helping Michael Williams with his basketball technique." Marcus set down his papers, his expression wary. "Yes, he's a talented player with college potential. The backboard adjustment was a simple fix that makes the sound less resonant." Victoria nodded. "It was a kind thing to do." She paused, then continued. "I've been working on a project at the coalition, analyzing predatory development practices and proposing alternatives. Elaine thinks it has potential to inform their advocacy work." Marcus leaned forward, genuine interest in his expression. "That sounds substantial, far beyond the basic requirements of your community service." "It is," Victoria acknowledged, "but I've realized I have knowledge that could be genuinely useful to them. And there's a specific situation I'd like your input on." She outlined the Parkview apartment situation and her embryonic idea for an alternative approach, a community land trust model that would preserve affordable housing while still allowing for necessary building improvements. It would require significant investment and creative financing, areas where Marcus's expertise would be invaluable. When she finished, Marcus was looking at her with an expression she hadn't seen in years, something akin to admiration. "This is important to you," he observed. "It is," Victoria confirmed, surprised by how firmly she meant it. "I've spent decades being part of the problem. I'd like to try being part of the solution." Marcus smiled, the genuine warmth in it reminding her of earlier years in their marriage. "Then let's see what we can do." 1 year after Judge Carter's ruling, the Oakwood Estates Neighborhood Association gathered for its annual summer picnic in the community park. Unlike previous years, when attendance had been predominantly white and conversations stilted by unspoken social hierarchies, today's event reflected a community transformed. Families of various backgrounds mingled freely, children played together on the sprawling lawn, and a spirit of genuine neighborliness pervaded the gathering. Near the grill station, James Williams and Marcus Harrington stood side by side, debating the merits of different barbecue techniques with the good-natured intensity of friends who had discovered a shared passion. Their unlikely alliance had blossomed over the past year, beginning with basketball coaching sessions for Michael and evolving into regular Sunday afternoon games that now included several other neighborhood fathers and their children. "You're still applying the sauce too early," James insisted, gesturing with his tongs. "It'll burn before the meat's properly cooked." "That's the point," Marcus countered. "The caramelization creates depth of flavor. Trust the process." Nearby, Diane Williams chatted with Margaret Chen and Lakshmi Patel, who had recently been elected president of the Neighborhood Association, a position Victoria Harrington had held unchallenged for over a decade, until declining to run again this year. "Have you seen the plans for the community garden?" Lakshmi was asking, showing photographs on her phone. "We've allocated space for 20 plots, plus a shared herb garden and children's section where the younger kids can learn about growing food." "It's a wonderful initiative," Diane agreed. "Tyler's already planning what he wants to plant. He's been volunteering with the garden at Parkview Apartments and has become quite the budding horticulturist." The mention of Parkview Apartments drew Victoria into their conversation. She had approached the group hesitantly, still conscious of the complicated history between herself and the women she had once viewed as unwelcome intruders in her neighborhood. "The Parkview Garden is impressive," Victoria offered. "Their community-supported agriculture program is becoming a model for other developments." The women nodded, making space for Victoria in their circle with a naturalness that would have been unimaginable a year earlier. Not friends exactly, but no longer adversaries. "How is the land trust progressing?" Diane inquired. Victoria's expression brightened with genuine enthusiasm. "The paperwork was finalized last week. Parkview is officially owned by the Community Land Trust now, which means the apartments will remain affordable in perpetuity. The renovation work begins next month, with residents involved in every stage of planning." What Victoria didn't mention was that she and Marcus had been instrumental in creating the financial structure that made the land trust possible, contributing both expertise and capital to secure the building's future. The Harrington name, once associated with luxury development and displacement, was gradually becoming linked with a different approach to community investment. Across the park, Michael, Zoe, and Tyler Williams played an impromptu game of frisbee with other neighborhood teenagers, their easy camaraderie a testament to how thoroughly they had been accepted into the community. Michael had made varsity basketball, Zoe had started a student advocacy group at her school, and Tyler's science project on urban gardening had won regional recognition, achievements that their neighbors now celebrated alongside them. As the afternoon progressed, Judge Marcus Carter made an unexpected appearance at the picnic. Now semi-retired, he still commanded respect as he moved through the gathering, greeting people warmly and accepting offers of food with gracious appreciation. Victoria noticed his arrival with a jolt of recognition. She hadn't seen him since the final day in court, when his ruling had upended her life in ways she could never have anticipated. After a moment's hesitation, she approached him. "Judge Carter," she greeted him formally. "I didn't expect to see you here today." The judge smiled, the lines around his eyes crinkling. "Mrs. Harrington, I make a point of attending community events when I can. It's important to see the real-world impact of judicial decisions, don't you think?" Victoria nodded, understanding the subtle reference to her case. "Yes, I believe it is." She paused, then added, "I completed my community service hours with the Fair Housing Coalition 6 months ago, 200 hours as ordered." "I'm aware," Judge Carter replied. "I'm also aware that you've continued volunteering there twice weekly since then, and that you've been instrumental in developing their new ethical development initiative." At Victoria's surprised expression, he added, "Elaine Jackson and I serve on several committees together. She speaks highly of your contributions." Victoria felt a flush of unexpected pride at this acknowledgement. "The work has become important to me." Judge Carter studied her thoughtfully. "When I issued my ruling in your case, Mrs. Harrington, I had hopes but no certainty about the outcome. The law can mandate actions, but it cannot dictate growth or change of heart. Those must come from within." "It wasn't immediate," Victoria admitted. "For the first few weeks at the coalition, I was just going through the motions, telling myself I was being unjustly punished. And then? And then I started listening, really listening, to the people who called the Housing Discrimination Hotline, To the residents at Parkview facing displacement. To my neighbors. She glanced toward where the Williams family was engaged in various conversations around the picnic area. I began to see patterns I'd been blind to before, including in my own behavior. Judge Carter nodded. That kind of self-reflection takes courage. It takes being forced to confront uncomfortable truths, Victoria corrected with a wry smile. I doubt I would have arrived here without your ruling. Perhaps, perhaps not, the judge replied. But the journey from that courtroom to this conversation was yours alone, Mrs. Harrington. No court order could have accomplished that. As Judge Carter moved on to greet other attendees, Victoria found herself approached by a newer neighbor, a young black couple who had moved into Oakwood Estates just 3 months earlier. Mrs. Harrington, the woman began tentatively, we wanted to thank you for your help with our home purchase. The seller's agent was being difficult about our financing, and your intervention made all the difference. Victoria waved away the thanks. It was nothing. Just a few calls to people who needed reminding about fair housing laws. It wasn't nothing to us, the husband insisted. It was the difference between getting our dream home and being shut out of this neighborhood. After they moved on, Victoria caught Diane Williams watching her with a thoughtful expression. The two women had developed a cautious rapport over the past year, built on small interactions and gradual dismantling of assumptions. You've changed, Diane observed as Victoria joined her at the dessert table. Victoria selected a strawberry tart before responding. Have I? Or have I just finally become the person I should have been all along? Diane smiled. Both, perhaps. Change isn't about becoming someone new so much as uncovering what was buried beneath fear and prejudice. Very professorial, Victoria remarked, but her tone held no malice, only a hint of wry acknowledgement. Occupational hazard, Diane admitted, but accurate nonetheless. As the summer evening descended, the gathering showed no signs of dispersing. Children played under the watchful eyes of parents who had learned to trust one another. Conversations flowed freely among neighbors who had discovered common ground beneath surface differences. The community that Victoria had once sought to protect through exclusion had become stronger through inclusion. Standing slightly apart from the crowd, Victoria observed it all with a complex mixture of emotions. Regret for the years spent enforcing artificial boundaries. Gratitude for the judge whose sentence had forced her to confront her prejudices. And something that felt surprisingly like contentment as she witnessed the vibrant community that had emerged from the ashes of her lawsuit. Marcus appeared at her side, handing her a glass of wine. Penny for your thoughts? Victoria accepted the glass, her gaze still sweeping across the gathering. I was just thinking about Judge Carter's ruling. At the time, I thought he was punishing me. Now I understand he was actually offering an opportunity. Marcus followed her gaze to where the Williams children were teaching younger kids how to throw a frisbee, their patience and enthusiasm drawing delighted laughter from their pupils. It's a better neighborhood now, he observed quietly. Victoria nodded, finally allowing herself to fully acknowledge the truth. It is. Not despite the changes I fought against, but because of them. As twilight settled over Oakwood Estates, the community remained gathered in harmony. Not perfect, not without occasional tensions and misunderstandings, but fundamentally transformed. Victoria Harrington, once the neighborhood's most vigorous gatekeeper, had become instead a reluctant bridge builder, discovering in the process that the community she had sought to preserve through exclusion could only truly thrive through openness and respect. Judge Carter's final sentence had indeed silenced her, not through punishment or humiliation, but by guiding her toward a truth that rendered her previous complaints meaningless, that neighborhoods, like the people who inhabit them, grow stronger through diversity, compassion, and the courage to change.